Ah, the fascinating world of idioms. Have you ever stopped to wonder about the quirky origins of the phrases we use every day? Well, get ready to dive headfirst into the wild and wacky history of our linguistic heritage. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but trust me, it's worth it. Let's start with the infamous scapegoat. You might think it's just a fancy way of saying fall guy, but the truth is much more bizarre. In ancient Hebrew tradition, a goat, yes, an actual goat, would be symbolically burdened with the sins of the people and sent into the wilderness on Yom Kippur. Talk about a bad day for the goat. Next up, we have caught red-handed. If you were a medieval poacher, this phrase would be a bit too literal for comfort. Back then, being caught with the blood of a freshly killed animal on your hands was considered irrefutable evidence of your crime. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase blood on your hands, doesn't it? Now let's talk about being saved by the bell. No, it's not just a popular 90s sitcom. This phrase actually harkens back to the world of 19th century boxing, where the ringing of the bell could literally save a fighter from being knocked out, or worse. Who knew a simple bell could be such a lifesaver? Now let's break the ice. No, we're not talking about literally smashing frozen water. This phrase actually has its roots in the world of sailing, where ships would have to break through ice to create a path for other vessels. Over time, it evolved to mean initiating a conversation or social interaction. Who knew small talk could be so adventurous? Speaking of pain, let's talk about kicking the bucket. No, it's not a morbid game of football. One popular theory suggests that this phrase comes from a rather gruesome method of slaughtering pigs, where the poor animal would be hung from a beam called a bucket. Before meeting its demise, it gives bringing home the bacon a whole new meaning. But hey, at least we're not letting the cat out of the bag. This phrase, which means revealing a secret, is thought to come from the old switcheroo scam of selling someone a pig in a sack, but swapping it out for a cat when they weren't looking. If the cat was let out of the bag, the jig was up. It's like the medieval version of a bait and switch. And what about mad as a hatter? Surprisingly, it's not just a reference to the Tea Party-loving character from Alice in Wonderland. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hat makers used mercury in the felting process, which caused some serious neurological damage. The resulting tremors and erratic behavior gave rise to the phrase, mad as a hatter. The more you know, the more you'll appreciate your mercury-free headwear. Now let's talk about barking up the wrong tree. This phrase, which means pursuing a misguided course of action, comes from the world of hunting. If a dog was barking at the base of a tree, where the prey wasn't hiding, it was said to be barking up the wrong tree. It's like the canine version of a wild goose chase. Now let's talk about burning the midnight oil. No, it's not some sort of late-night arson. The phrase, which means working late into the night, comes from a time before electricity, when people would quite literally burn oil lamps to keep working after dark. It's like the historical version of pulling an all-nighter. But what about spilling the beans? This phrase, which means revealing a secret, is thought to come from ancient Greece, where people voted by placing beans in jars. If someone accidentally knocked over the jar, the beans would spill out and the secret vote would be revealed. It's like the Athenian version of a leaked ballot. Now, let's talk about being under the weather. No, it doesn't mean you're literally buried under a pile of rain clouds. The phrase actually comes from the world of sailing, where sick sailors would be sent below deck to recover, literally putting them under the weather. It's like calling in sick to work, but with more seasickness and fewer emails. And what about throwing in the towel? This phrase, which means giving up, comes from the world of boxing. When a fighter was taking a beating, their trainer would literally throw a towel into the ring to signal that they were conceding the match. It's like the pugilistic version of waving a white flag. But what about costing an arm and a leg? No, it's not some sort of black market body part trade. The phrase is thought to come from the world of portrait painting, where including more limbs in the picture would make it more expensive. It's like the artistic equivalent of upcharging for extra toppings. Now let's talk about cutting the mustard. No, it's not some sort of condiment-based hazing ritual. The phrase, which means meeting a certain standard, is thought to come from the world of mustard making. Apparently, mustard seeds are notoriously difficult to grind, so if you couldn't cut the mustard, you weren't doing your job right. It's like the culinary version of shape up or ship out. And what about being fit as a fiddle? This phrase, which means being in good health, is thought to come from the idea that a well-crafted fiddle or violin is a thing of beauty and precision. Just like a healthy body, a finely tuned fiddle is a marvel of form and function. It's like the musical version of being in tip-top shape. But what about going the whole hog? This phrase, which means doing something thoroughly or completely, is thought to come from the world of hog roasts. If you're going to roast a pig, you might as well go all out and roast the whole thing, right? It's like the barbecue version of in for a penny, in for a pound. Speaking of pennies and pounds, let's talk about being in for a penny, in for a pound. This phrase, which means committing fully to something once you've started, is thought to come from the world of gambling. If you're willing to bet a penny, you might as well go all in and bet a pound. It's like the high-stakes version of go big or go home. Now let's talk about hitting the sack. No, it's not some sort of aggressive pillow fight. The phrase, which means going to bed, is thought to come from the days when mattresses were literally sacks filled with straw or feathers. Hitting the sack meant flopping down on your bed for some well-deserved rest. It's like the historical version of crashing for the night. But what about jumping on the bandwagon? This phrase, which means hopping on board with a popular trend or movement, is thought to come from the world of politics. In the 19th century, politicians would literally ride around on bandwagons to drum up support for their campaigns. Jumping on the bandwagon meant aligning yourself with a popular candidate or cause. It's like the historical version of following the crowd. Now, let's talk about something being a piece of cake. No, it doesn't mean it's literally a slice of dessert. The phrase, which means something is easy, is thought to come from the world of cakewalks. In the late 19th century, cakewalks were a type of dance contest where the prize was, you guessed it, a cake. Apparently, winning a cakewalk was so easy that it became synonymous with a simple task. It's like the historical version of a walk in the park. But what about stealing someone's thunder? This phrase, which means taking credit for someone else's idea or achievement, is thought to come from the world of theatre. In the early 18th century, a playwright named John Dennis came up with a new method for creating the sound of thunder on stage. When a rival theatre used his technique without giving him credit, he accused them of stealing his thunder. It's like the dramatic version of plagiarism. And finally, let's talk about taking something with a grain of salt. No, it doesn't mean seasoning your food with skepticism. The phrase, which means viewing something with a healthy dose of doubt, is thought to come from ancient Rome. Back then, it was believed that a pinch of salt could neutralize poison. So, when you take something with a grain of salt, you're not swallowing it whole, just in case it's toxic. It's like the historical version of trust but verify. Phew. That was quite a journey through the wild and wacky world of idioms. But what can we learn from all these bizarre phrases and their even stranger origins? These idioms remind us of the power of metaphor. By comparing abstract concepts to concrete, relatable things like animals, objects, and everyday experiences, we make them more understandable and memorable. It's like giving our ideas a tangible form, something we can grasp and hold on to. And of course, these phrases also remind us of the importance of context. Just like it's easy to misinterpret an idiom if you don't know its origin or intended meaning, it's easy to misunderstand a situation or a person if you don't take the time to learn their backstory and perspective. Language, like life, is often more complex and nuanced than it appears on the surface. So the next time you find yourself barking up the wrong tree or biting off more than you can chew, take a moment to appreciate the rich history and colorful imagery behind these expressions. And if someone accuses you of beating a dead horse by continuing to explore the origins of idioms, just tell them you're giving credit where credit is due. After all, the study of language is a labor of love, not a flash in the pan. But hey, that's just my 2 cents. What about you, dear reader? Do you have a favorite idiom or phrase that you've always wondered about? Have you ever found yourself up a creek without a paddle when trying to decipher the meaning of a particular expression? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. After all, sharing is caring.